everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is something that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. It's an honor and privilege to both take part in this conversation, to learn from the incredible sessions yesterday, and I look forward to many sessions this afternoon, and then also to share with you a little bit about the work that the organization that I represent has been doing, and to show the areas of similarity and difference between some of the conversations that are happening with the companies that I work with and the conversation that's happening here. I'll give you a preview, though, which is that I think there are actually more areas of overlap than areas of difference. So I'd like to talk to you about leadership and trends in global corporate giving, but before I do that, I'm going to make the wild assumption that you might not have heard of our organization before and tell you a little bit about who we are so that you understand where the information that I'm sharing today comes from. So a little bit of history on our organization. Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy was started in 1999 by the actor and philanthropist Paul Newman. And it was his belief at the time that corporations could and should be a force for good in society. And what he and a number of other CEOs sought to do was find like-minded leaders who believed in the same thing. Find the CEOs of organizations who believed that community success was an essential measure of business performance, that you cannot have community success and corporate success traveling in different trajectories, that they're intertwined, and that as business succeeds, society should be succeeding along with it. And so over the last 15 years, a number of CEOs have signed on to this mission to create a better world through business. And so our nonprofit organization works with the CEOs of the companies that you see here to find out how to take action on that belief system. How do you actually bring to life those values in your corporation and in your community? So we do media work with them, we provide research and benchmarking, which I'll touch on a little bit later, and then support to them to overcome the little obstacles along the way, because as anyone in this room knows, giving away money is a lot harder than people realize who don't do it every day. And so it's important to have forums like this to share best practice, and that's something that we do with our organization with the companies that you see here. So I certainly don't want to presume to tell this audience how much can change in a short period of time. It's very special for me to be here on the 20th anniversary for you all, but I did want to take advantage of the fact that both Trialogue and CECP were started 15 years ago, which I think makes Nick Rocky the Paul Newman of South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, in starting Trialogue 15 years ago as Paul Newman was starting CECP. And so we wanted to use this opportunity to just take stock of how much the world has changed in the short 15 years since our two organizations were founded. So I'm going to share a couple of highlights from an infographic that we did earlier this year with you. One is population growth. The world's population has gone from 6 billion to 7 billion people in the last 15 years. Mobile phones, 25 million mobile phones shipped in 1999. It was 6.8 billion most recently. Blogs, citizen journalism, transparency, there were 100 blogs in 1999. There are 120 million today. So I pull out these statistics to say that the world is changing very quickly, both within our countries and then around the world. And these factors, population growth, transparency, mobile interconnectivity, I think have very big implications for grant seekers and grant makers who have come together in this room. I've been with CECP for 10 years, and in the 10 years that I've been with the organization, things have changed even remarkably. My first week on the job, The Economist magazine landed on my desk, and this was the image on the cover. And the title story was "The Good Company, ? A skeptical look at corporate social responsibility." Well, today The Economist is hosting conferences on corporate social responsibility, but just 10 years ago, their cover story was a skeptical look at whether companies' intentions were actually good. I think we've come a long way since then. Now to be here together talking about these important themes, it's nice to see that Trialogue was so far ahead of The Economist on this topic, looking at the intersection between community expectations and what was possible with our corporations. So what I want to use our time together this morning to do is to look at leadership and trends in corporate giving from three different angles. First of all, reviewing kind of the way that the strategy has changed over time. then taking a look at the data that CECP publishes, which was our first connection point with the CSI index, and then some of the conversations that our CEOs and giving officers have been having recently. So let's start with an unscientific look at the way that corporate giving has changed. I expect this will be a familiar trajectory to many of you who have lived through it. This is what the companies that are headquartered in the US are saying, which is that while none of these strategies is wrong, there's been a movement at the center of the conversation. 15, 20 years ago, a lot of giving that we saw from corporations was what we call reactive or heartstrings given. I think of the matrix that Kathy shared yesterday and the different quadrants for the types of giving that could exist, and there was charitable giving kind of in the lower left quadrant and strategic philanthropy in the upper right. And I think this trajectory mirrors a little bit of movement from the bottom left to the upper right. So 15 years ago, you gave because people asked. You gave because you wanted to be a good neighbor. You gave because it was the right thing to do. And many of our companies told us that they intentionally didn't seek business benefits or a strong alignment with the business because they feared a public backlash. That the mentality that prevailed at the time was that if you're getting something out of it, it's not philanthropy. There was a disconnect with the concept of a business benefit coming from philanthropy, and so many companies intentionally stayed away from that. But over time, that perception has thawed a little bit, and there's been more open-mindedness to the fact that there can be many motivations for giving and many rewards for giving, that society and business can benefit at the same time. And as some companies saw others start to get a little bit of credit, they started to talk a little bit more openly about what they were doing. And as they were talking more openly about what they were doing, the underlying programs were shifting too. They were moving away from programs that intentionally didn't have anything to do with their expertise or products towards ones that were more aligned. If you were a textbook publisher, you were giving those textbooks for free to schools, that type of thing. But over time, also, companies became even more strategic. They started to ask themselves, where should we focus? Can we co-create programs with our nonprofit partners? Creating a portfolio of grant making, some that was commercially oriented, some that responded to employee requests, some that responded to areas of expertise that they had. And so gradually over time, we've seen companies move the center of their giving towards a more strategic place. Now, local reactive giving still happens, but it's a smaller portion of the overall portfolio of what a company gives. So as this is taking place, as this move towards more strategic grant making among companies has been happening, the context in which business operates has been changing too. I touched on some of the statistics from our infographic, but a couple of years ago, CECP did a joint report with McKinsey, and we looked at the 5 forces that were having the biggest influence on what it means to compete as a business today. I don't need to tell you that businesses are bigger than they've ever been in the history of the world. Walmart, for example, we had the CEO of Walmart speaking at a conference of ours in February. They have 2.2 million employees. The revenues are unlike the revenues that we've ever seen in the history of the world. And so with that, what it means to be a company and what it means to compete has radically changed. So a couple of the forces here. One is, where is the center of the global economy? We're seeing that shift actually from west to east. If you look at economists' projections of where the center of activity will be economically in a couple of years, it's going to move over to Asia. If you look at the commodity prices, water, oil, they're rising. Things that used to be considered in abundance or cheap, essential inputs to business have now become a pretty substantial cost, and companies need to think dearly now about their use of water, their use of oil, their use of other commodities. We also have big demographic shifts in different parts of the world. So there's a youth bulge, for example, in the Middle East, but there's an aging population in Japan and the United States, and what does that mean for our productivity? How will our companies seek to grow? There's also a competition among the countries of the world to attract corporate headquarters. There was actually an interesting headline that I saw yesterday that Vodafone was moving an innovation center from Silicon Valley back to London. I'm not commenting on that decision at all, only to say that that's happening, that companies are picking up and moving their geographies because countries are competing to host those companies. And then also our global interconnectivity. You know, a series of bad mortgages in Las Vegas can collapse the government of Finland. So these things are really changing what it means to operate today, how we think of the role of business in society, and along with it, public expectations for the role that a company will have in society. So whether your company is moving towards a mindset of blending profits and purpose because you're seeking new growth, because you want to access new markets, or because you're pursuing innovation, or whether you're being pulled there because your stakeholders are demanding transparency, there's raw material scarcity that takes you to other parts of the world and engages you in other social issues, companies are arriving in the same place, which is this conversation that I think is very exciting about what's the role of business in society, and can we start to develop business models that blend societal success and business success at the same time. I mentioned before that we're a CEO organization. We're in conversations with our CEOs, so I selected a quote from the CEO of Novartis, a major pharmaceuticals company, and it says, "Changes in the external environment and a generational shift are creating a greater awareness among businesses and a greater need to act." So the CEOs are seeing these same things that you all have been seeing and talking about for a while. So what I want to do now is transition to what this has looked like in the data that we collect. How have we seen companies' CSI budgets change over time? And I'm going to draw a couple of parallels to the data that Kathy shared with us yesterday from the CSI index. So CECP each year conducts a survey of the companies that participate with us. We had 240 companies participate, and we asked them all manner of questions about how their giving is changing. How much did you give? How much was from the foundation? How much was non-cash? How big are your teams? How much was international? How much are you giving to different programmatic focus areas? And so we take the results from that, and our version of the CSI handbook is the Giving in Numbers report. Anybody who's interested in that can download it. It's a free resource at any time. The companies who participate in this survey tend to be the larger companies. So median revenues for the companies who participate is close to 16 billion US dollars. The typical company in this sample has about 32,000 employees. Annual giving, or CSI, for these companies, all of which must run through a nonprofit intermediary, is hovering at about 20 million US dollars per year. Most of them have a corporate foundation. So the data I'm going to share with you over the next couple of slides is drawn from this research. The first one is that we saw something surprising, which is that giving actually was quicker to come back for most companies, not all, than revenues or pre-tax profits. That giving, however, was driven by non-cash or product donations, not so much cash. We've seen a recent resurgence in cash, but a lot of it was actually non-cash or product giving, which I think is exciting because that's something that makes corporate giving special, is the ability to leverage your non-cash assets. And then fewer larger grants given to fewer cause areas, which I think has a lot of implications both for the grant makers in the audience today, but also those from the nonprofit community. So here are some of the data points that reinforce the trends I was just talking about. So if you look at the red bars, that is median revenues for our companies over time. So you see the impact of the economic downturn for the companies in our sample was quite sharp in 2008, went down further still in 2009, started to trend upward again in most recent years, but still hadn't recovered to where it was before the downturn started. The same thing with the blue bars that show us the profits. I mean, the most important thing to look for in this graph, because I know it's a little bit hard all the way from the back, is whether the bar all the way on the right-hand side is taller or shorter than the one on the left. And in both cases, it's shorter, meaning revenues and profits hadn't recovered. But when we look at what happened in giving over that same time period, using the same companies each year, a matched set of companies from 2007 to 2012, we saw that the majority of these companies increased their giving. So even though financial performance hadn't fully recovered, the giving has exceeded, in some cases by quite a bit, where it was in 2007 for these same companies. So what you have here, I'll take a second to explain what this diagram is we take a company's giving in 2007, we look at that same company's giving in the most recent year, and we say, did their giving go up or down, and by how much? And then we slot them in a percentage category. It was up between 2 and 10%, it was up between 10 and 25%, it was up 25% or more. So we go company by company, and we say, how much did your giving go up or down, calculate the percentage, and then create this distribution. So that's what you're seeing here, is a distribution of companies based on how much their giving has changed. So you see that 38% of companies, their giving compared to where it was in 2007 is up by 25% or more. Overall, more companies are giving more than they were before the downturn started. Some companies are giving way less, however, and we see some industry trends in that. For example, our publicly utility companies, those that provide electricity, are still suffering financially and their giving performance is down. But the majority of companies have been able to extend their giving beyond where it was in the past. Again, a little bit hard to see, but this chart reminds me very much of Kathy's presentation yesterday, where it was looking at CSI in the South African context over time, and there was this gentle upward trend even when adjusted for inflation. Well, this is aggregate total giving for us. So this is just a straight sum of how giving has changed for a set of companies that participated each of these years, and you see it growing. But the bottom blue bar that seems to be getting larger and larger and larger, that's product giving or pro bono service or other forms of non-cash. So you see that that's actually driving the story. As a percentage of the overall aggregate of what companies give, it's gone from 57% to 69%. So I think we have to ask ourselves some questions. We're asking these questions of the companies we participate with. Are nonprofits equipped to handle non-cash as they are to handle cash? Are we equipping our nonprofit partners to be able to make use of these product donations? Because that's a different type of management required to make use of product and cash. I know that I've spoken to many development officers at nonprofit organizations who say, you know, my compensation is based on my ability to raise cash, not product. And so I think it's causing a number of different conversations about the partnerships between corporations and their nonprofit partners when a lot of the giving that's happening that's driving increasing growth is non-cash. We ask our companies, why are you giving more if you're among those who are giving more, or why did your giving decrease if you're among the companies whose giving has fallen over that time period? So the first one we just talked about, we had an increase in non-cash contributions. I think immediately in the wake of the economic downturn, one of the trends that we saw was there was actually a mismatch in how much product had been produced when global demand for that product had fallen. So they had produced as if the global economy was going to continue to thrive, when in fact a downturn was underway, so they had excess inventory. And so we saw companies very quickly redirect their excess inventory to the nonprofit sector. Improved business performance, some of our companies actually were hit early in the economic downturn and have recovered, and their giving has as well. There's an education crisis in the United States, kind of a lot of dissatisfaction with how US students are doing in an international context. Companies see that as a national security issue. They see it as a workforce development issue. They're investing above and beyond what they had in the past to support education. Sometimes it's just the companies in the survey are twice the size they were because two large companies have come together. US companies have seen a lot of mergers between large financial institutions and large pharmaceutical companies. So sometimes who you were as a company 6 years ago doesn't at all reflect the size and scale of your business that it does today. And then again, something that Kathy was talking about in her presentation yesterday is sometimes it's just better tracking of contributions. Our underlying definition has stayed the same, but actually counting it up and reporting it has become more sophisticated over time. For companies whose giving has fallen, sometimes that's been a reflection, again, of the financial crunch on that particular company or that particular industry. Also, sometimes the incidence rate of natural disasters to which a company responds changes their overall giving rate. So, for example, if there's a major disaster either within the country in which the company is headquartered or in a jurisdiction in which they have a lot of employees, they'll do above and beyond grant making, but if there isn't a similar disaster in a subsequent year, it appears as if their giving has fallen. And then something that I'll be touching on in a moment is a refreshing of their focus areas and an increased focus in where companies are giving. This chart looks a little bit complicated, but the main takeaway from this, because I think this is actually a very important slide, is this slide shows us how companies are increasingly narrowing the causes that they fund. So CECP's survey looks at 9 different funding focus areas: health and human services, kindergarten through high school education versus higher education or university, arts, the environment. And what we see in this chart, the line that you see going up over time, is the number of companies for whom 50% or more of their giving is going to a single focus area. So for example, if I talk to one of my healthcare companies, they can say, let me tell you my focus areas. My focus areas are increasing access to medicines, ensuring greater safety and health within a hospital setting, and helping more women own their own pharmacies. Well, all three of those things are within health and human services. So they're concentrating their giving, even though they might have a variety of signature programs, they're doing it increasingly within a narrower band. This next slide shows a trend that I think works well as a complement to the one I just showed you, which is at the same time they're focusing, average grant size is getting larger. So if you look at the orange line that's trending upward over time, for the typical company in our survey, a grant was $30,000. But in the most recent survey, it was $45,000. So good news and bad news. If you're one of the nonprofits that a company is funding, they're becoming focused on you and the grant sizes are getting larger. But that can also send a chill up the back of anybody who has had a hard time attracting corporate attention because it's getting harder than ever. So companies are focusing and they're making the grant sizes bigger, but it's not evenly distributed. So you have to find a company who sees your nonprofit's value proposition as being within their funding areas. Otherwise, it's getting harder and harder to attract those funds. So the last area that I wanted to talk about was, in addition to the strategy and in addition to the data, what are some of the CEOs that we work with talking about these days? What are some of the foundation presidents that we work with talking about these days? And a lot of what they're talking about is what you all are talking about. I see it woven throughout the agenda: shared value, collaboration, measuring outcomes. So many community and economic development. Great session on that yesterday. I wanted to choose three, though, to focus on with you all, which is a broadened leadership agenda for our CEOs. Kind of the definition of what it means to lead a company, I think, is fundamentally different. And we're having conversations with our CEOs about that expanded mandate. I also see an internal competition within our companies between the concepts of sustainability, philanthropy, and shared value. There seems to be an internal war going on between which of these ideas should be primary, and then measuring impact. So let's start with the role of the CEO and how we've seen this change in recent times. Now, don't be too alarmed by this polling result. This is a polling result that we did at our most recent conference of CEOs in February, and it was meant to pump them up a little bit. There's a little bit of ego in here, and we only allowed them to choose one answer. So it's not like I think this is a very scientific polling result, but we asked these CEOs, who's going to lead progress towards long-term societal improvement? And you'll see that at least half of the audience said companies. It's us. We need to do that. Now, I don't think that means they're doing it alone. I don't think it means they're doing it at the exclusion of partnership, but I do think it means that they're seeing a role for themselves in societal progress. I think if you had asked this question 20 years ago, you would have seen a very different answer. So I don't interpret this data to mean that companies think they can do it alone or that they're the experts, but I do take it to mean they see it as part of what they should be doing, that they should be a partner, they should have a voice, they should be part of the solution. And so one of the CEOs who was in attendance at this meeting, Richard Edelman is the largest public relations agency in the world, introduced this concept of the CEO not being something seen as the chief executive officer. The CEO is the chief engagement officer. It's the role of the CEO to engage all of the stakeholders in this conversation about the role of business in society, and to do it to build trust, to do it with humility, and to do it with some conviction about the resources that a company can bring to societal problem solving. But when we look at an increased mandate for CEOs, there are some fundamental tensions, I think, that they encounter in their leadership. So it's always been the role of a CEO, I think, to inspire the employees under his or her leadership. But what's happening with that employee base is there's a tension. You have some employees in the company who are impatient for the company to do more, who are really calling for the company to take seriously the corporate social responsibility agenda of the company and manifest that in many ways. But you have other employees in the very same company who are skeptical, who are resistant, who don't believe that that's the role of business. It's not what they were taught. So the CEO has to walk the line between the skeptical employees and those who are eager for the company to do more. The same thing with consumers. I think now the broadened mandate of CEO leadership is to ask consumers to think about the sustainability of their choices and to think about how their purchases and their decisions affect the broader society. But we know that some consumers will want whatever product is cheapest regardless of the sustainability implications, whereas other consumers resist products that have a large sustainability impact. And so how do you navigate this world between the different kind of opposite tensions of the consumers who want you to do more and then the consumers who want the products at the cheapest price? The same thing with investors. Some investors are going to only hold your stock for a very brief period of time, and what they care about most is your profitability within that short time horizon. But then we have other forms of investors, and I think this is a growing community of investors, who expect your company to be in it for the long term. They want your company to be profitable over a longer time horizon. So how do you strike a balance between the short-term expectations of some investors and the longer-term expectations of others? And then your partners. How do you work with other companies in your industry? How do you work with nonprofits? How do you maintain a competitive advantage while still tackling some of the most important social problems of our time? So we asked CEOs, well, what can you do? What are you prepared to do? So another polling result from our CEOs was, what is the most effective step that you can take as a CEO to help restore public trust in business? And they said to us, I need to be out there speaking more. I need to be authentically saying in my voice why I think this is important. I need to be thinking about the scope of my leadership and talking about it more publicly. The second most popular answer choice among our CEOs was, if I believe in this, if this is important to me, then I need to weave it into the incentives of my company. I can't say it's important in a speech and then not reward my employees for doing it when they're compensated. So I need better alignment between what I'm saying and what I'm paying people to do. So the next trend I wanted to talk about was what I perceive as an internal competition between the concepts of sustainability, philanthropy, and shared value. So what I've got up here are not necessarily quotes I believe, but quotes that I've heard over time from different audiences, some of which are critical of sustainability, some of which are critical of philanthropy, and some of which are critical of shared value. So I've heard some people say, and I think this was even a tweet yesterday from Junior Achievement saying, not every social problem has a commercial solution. That's something that I believe. But if shared value has at its center solving social problems through business strategy, mightn't there be some social problems that don't have a commercial solution? I think that's one of the critiques of shared value. Even though I support shared value, I recognize there are some gaps that shared value won't tackle. I've heard some companies say, this concept of giving back implies that I took something. Peter Brabeck-Letmathe of Nestle says this all the time. In fact, we had him as a keynote speaker at one of our conferences, and that's what he said at the opening, which, as the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, was a little unsettling. Or some companies, particularly my companies in California, I was out there last December, the CEO of Apple, Steve Jobs, used to say, it's our products that are changing the world. I'm going to focus on making the best products I can. Philanthropy is secondary. So I'm seeing all of these different voices and perspectives that are creating this internal competition between these concepts. I looked at this PowerPoint presentation from the back of the room. I know there's no way you could possibly see it back there, so let me walk you through this, which is, again, an excerpt from a report that we did with Accenture, which is about our belief, and I'm sure many of you in the room feel the same way, is that this isn't a choice. This is a false trade-off between focusing on the sustainability of your company, focusing on your performance, focusing on philanthropy, and then looking for opportunities for shared value. These are actually complementary strategies that can actually all work together and reinforce one another as opposed to being in opposition. So the core mandate of a company, and many CEOs feel this because this is what they were taught in business school, it's what I was taught in business school, is your primary duty is to create products and services that people want at a price they can afford, create jobs, and pay taxes. That's your core business mandate. That's where a lot of people think their leadership ends. But on top of that, there's being a responsible steward of the resources under your care, whether that's employees or raw materials or the communities in which you operate. And then also philanthropy, to kind of provide a bridge to solving problems that are not touched by your core business, and then shared value or sustainable value creation on top of that as a strategy to say, might we think of products and services that solve a social problem and create revenue at the same time? Indra Nooyi, who is the CEO of PepsiCo, spoke at one of our conferences not long ago. For those of you who are familiar with what she's been talking about lately, she's got PepsiCo aligned under what she calls her performance with purpose agenda. And performance with purpose, to her, I think, is on the vanguard, which is we've got to have the business performance. We've got to keep our investors happy. We have to show that we're a relevant company. If we're not earning, it'll be immaterial what Pepsi does in philanthropy very soon. We have to take care of our people. We have to take care of the environment, and we have to take care of our communities. So this is what it means to be a CEO today. It's no longer just that you can do the first part, which is providing products and services, creating jobs, and paying taxes. So the last trend I wanted to talk about is impact measurement. I know there's a session on measuring outcomes coming up in the agenda. A lot of times companies come to us and they say, I have 10 minutes with my CEO, I have 10 minutes with my board of director. He or she is going to ask, what have we gotten for the spend that we've done? What does it all mean? I need to know my impact. I want to measure my impact. I want to measure my impact. But when you start to actually truly get into an impact measurement conversation, you find that there are lots of different things that can be measured. First of all, we find a lot of companies have a hard time even understanding what they gave. If you're a company, Western Union is one of our companies, kind of electronic funds transfer business, they're operating in 200 countries. Summing up the total of what that company has given in 200 countries is quite a job. So the first thing we ask companies to think about is, how good a handle do you even have on what you gave, your inputs? The next thing that can be known is what that money bought, what activities you undertook, how many workshops did you create, how many soup kitchens did you fund. Then the outputs, how many people went through that training program, how many students got that mentoring opportunity. Then the outcomes, which is what social good was generated from those outputs, and then the impact, which is the longer lasting societal change. So CECP published a research report on this called Measuring the Value of Corporate Philanthropy. Again, this is a free resource for anybody who's interested. But we asked our companies, how many of you are actually doing this? How many of you are actually looking at your outcomes and impacts? Now, this is self-reported, unaudited, but 76% of the companies who answered this question said, we are measuring our outcomes or impacts. 24% said we're not. I think this is a little inflated, frankly. I think some people who didn't have a good answer to this question skipped the question. But those who were brave enough to provide an answer, this is what they said. But they also said at the same time that it's early days for them. They haven't been doing this very long. Almost half of them said, we've been doing this for 2 years or less. So for those of you who are starting to think about the impact question and how to measure your outcomes, know that if you're just getting started, or even if you're not doing it yet, you're in good company. Now, what I do find in my conversations with companies is there are two types of impacts that you can have. You can have an impact on society and then also an impact on the business. I think a lot of the impact measurement conversation has been on the impact on society, which I think is good and appropriate. But this model also shows ways you can have a conversation on how the grant you made that did good in society can also have very tangible business benefits, whether that's managing the risk of the firm, reducing costs, increasing revenues, building intangibles, the loyalty of your employees, the word of mouth, things like that. So I won't go into this in detail, but just wanted to encourage people to think about, as you have an impact measurement conversation, be thinking simultaneously about the societal value and the business value to understand the total impact that you've had. So just a couple of thoughts for you on impact measurement as we enter that session for those of you who will choose that in the breakout opportunity. One thing we find often is that companies either make a grant and then ask what their impact was afterwards, or just collect whatever they can collect as they're going. And one piece of advice that we have for people is, please have a specific purpose or decision that you're prepared to make that is guiding the measures that you're going to collect. Either have a specific thing that you're trying to improve, or decision that you're prepared to make, or reporting requirement. Otherwise, you'll just be counting whatever's easiest to count. And measurement is most powerful when you're prepared to actually let it change what you're doing, to have it be a learning tool for you. So rather than having it be a rear view mirror that you look in to decide whether or not what you did was good, have it be something that's a tool for you to improve the practice of what you're doing over time. Now, that might not meet the rigid requirement of the definition of impact measurement, but I think it'll be a lot more valuable for the grant-making process as you go. Something that I think is also important is this temptation to kind of overstate the impact that you've had. If you've run an after-school program, you want to say that you've changed those students' lives forever. You probably have had a very important impact on those students' lives, but be conservative in how much you claim that you've actually done, recognizing that a lot of forces come together to impact the students' performance. And then also to understand the overall arc of the societal issue that you're trying to impact and be realistic about the piece of that arc that you're trying to influence. Rather than claiming to have had an impact over the entire story of someone's education, if what you did was more limited, understand how the impact of what you did, what your activities were, fit into that larger story. And then also give yourselves permission to measure selectively. There's an opportunity cost to measurement, which is more grant making. And I think companies have this conversation with themselves about how much measurement should I do versus more grant making. I think there is a right balance. You'll have to find it for yourselves, but I think what this means is you don't need to measure the impact of everything. Give yourselves permission to pick and choose and to learn. So a couple of key takeaways from what we've just discussed. One is this, kind of how much the world has changed and how much the world will continue to change. And I think those with responsibilities on the front lines of the nonprofit sector, but also corporate giving sector, have a responsibility to understand and track those changes and understand the implications of those changes for your work. The second takeaway is that there's been a drive towards focus in corporate giving, and we need to think seriously and talk actively, nonprofits and corporate partners and government, about what the implications of that is. What does it mean that companies are becoming more focused? What does it mean that dollar grants are becoming higher? And what does it mean that companies are making greater use of what makes them unique givers, the non-cash assets, and then a new role for companies and CEOs, and thinking about the broad leadership, management, and leading beyond the walls of your business. So if you like data, I invite you again to download the Giving in Numbers report and then also the CSI handbook. CECP has published a number of infographics on our latest data. That's all free of charge for you all. If the CEO perspective is of interest to you, I invite you to check out CECP's YouTube channel and the executive summaries from some of our reports. Impact measurement, I referenced the Measuring the Value of Corporate Philanthropy report, and then look forward to a conversation with you all on social media. If you take part in Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, would love to be in conversation with you there. I will be here the rest of the day. I don't have time for questions, but look forward to speaking with anyone one-on-one if anything that I've shared today resonates with you, or if you have any questions or critiques of the data that I've presented here. Thank you very much. You do? Oh, great.